Story number 1.
The storm had come in fast, swallowing the narrow back road in a curtain of white. Jenna gripped the steering wheel, leaning forward to see through the thick snowflakes hammering her windshield. The wipers worked furiously, but they couldn't keep up. She knew she shouldn't have waited so long to leave her friend's cabin, but time had gotten away from her, and now she was paying for it. The road twisted through miles of dense forest, the trees looming on either side, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Her headlights reflected off the snow-covered ground, casting eerie shadows. She glanced at her phone. No signal. Just as she turned her eyes back to the road, something darted across her path. She gasped, slamming the brakes. The tires skidded on the ice, and the car slid sideways before coming to a stop. Heart pounding, she peered into the darkness. Had she imagined it? A deer, maybe? Her hands were shaking as she exhaled, trying to steady herself. Then she saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones, in the deep snow, leading from the trees to the road. But there were no prints on the other side. Whatever had crossed hadn't finished. Jenna swallowed hard. The storm howled around her, rattling the car. She forced herself to breathe and put the car back into drive. Slowly, cautiously, she moved forward, her tires crunching over the icy road. The footprints disappeared in her rearview mirror. But the unease remained. A mile ahead, the snow was coming down heavier. She squinted through the windshield, trying to focus. The last thing she needed was to go off the road in the middle of nowhere. Then she saw something again. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. Jenna's foot hovered over the brake, her pulse hammering. The figure didn't move. It was tall, wrapped in something dark, maybe a coat. As she passed, she turned her head slightly, trying to get a better look. It had no face, or rather the snow and darkness obscured its features completely, and then it was gone. Just gone. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. She pressed the gas harder, the car lurching forward. Her hands ached from how tightly she gripped the wheel. The storm thickened. She headed to the main road. Then the knocking started, a soft, deliberate tap on the passenger window. Her stomach dropped. The car was moving. No one should be knocking. She turned her head, dreading what she might see. Nothing. The window was frosted over, her breath fogging the inside. Another knock, this time from the back seat. Jenna's blood turned to ice. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. Instead, she gritted her teeth and floored the gas. The engine roared as the car sped down the snowy road. She didn't care if she lost control. She just had to get away. The knocking stopped, but the temperature inside the car plummeted. Her breath came out in ragged cough, visible gasps. Then the whisper came, right behind her ear. "Let me in," Jenna screamed. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She swerved. The car spun violently, tires skidding over the ice. The world outside became a blur of white and black. And then impact. The car slammed into something, a massive jolt that sent her head snapping forward. Pain exploded in her skull. Then everything went still. For a moment, all she could hear was the wind and the distant creak of bending trees. Her vision blurred as she lifted her head, dazed. The car had come to a stop just inches from a massive tree. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. She was alive. But she wasn't alone. A shape was outside the driver's side window, close. Jenna turned her head slowly, terror constricting her throat. The figure was there, pressed against the glass. Its face was inches from hers. But it wasn't a face at all, just a dark void where features should have been. Then the glass cracked. Jenna let out a choked sob and scrambled for the door handle, her fingers numb and uncooperative. The door groaned as she shoved it open, the freezing wind nearly knocking her off her feet. She ran, blindly through the deep snow, stumbling toward the trees. Behind her, the wind carried a sound, low, distorted laughter. She didn't stop. She ran until her lungs burned, until the cold bit so deep into her skin she thought she might never feel warm again. Then she saw the lights, headlights, a pair of them flickering through the storm. A car. Jenna pushed forward, waving frantically as the vehicle slowed. The driver, an older man with a concerned expression, rolled down his window. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice filled with worry. Jenna turned back toward the road. Her car was gone, not crashed, not abandoned, just gone. The snow lay undisturbed where it should have been. She turned back to the man, her body shaking violently. "I don't know," she whispered. He opened the door. "Come on, let's get you warm." Jenna hesitated, glancing back one last time. Far down the road, nearly swallowed by the storm, a figure stood watching. Still. Silent. Waiting. Jenna climbed into the stranger's car without another word. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm had started earlier than expected. Mark had been driving for hours, hoping to make it back to his hometown before nightfall, but the weather had other plans. The highway was barely visible under the thick snow, and his truck's headlights reflected off the swirling white, making it even harder to see. He knew he should have booked a motel for the night, but he had wanted to be home, especially tonight. It was the anniversary of his sister's death. A sharp gust of wind shook the truck as he turned onto the last stretch of road before the long wooded path leading into town. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, trying to keep control. The trees lining the road were heavy with snow. Their bare branches weighed down, creating eerie shapes in the darkness. He had driven this road countless times before, but something about it felt different tonight. The first sign that something was wrong came when his headlights caught a figure standing at the side of the road. Mark's heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the snow, but as he got closer, he saw her clearly. A young woman, barefoot in the snow, wearing only a thin white dress. Her dark hair hung over her face, obscuring her features. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge the truck at all. Mark's instincts told him to keep driving, but something about her was eerily familiar. He slowed the truck, pulling up beside her. "Hey, are you okay?" he called through the rolled-down window. No response. She just stood there, unmoving, her head slightly tilted. Mark hesitated, his skin prickled with unease. He knew better than to pick up a stranger in the middle of nowhere, but leaving her out here in this storm felt wrong. "Do you need a ride?" he asked, leaning slightly toward the window. The woman slowly turned her head toward him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale, her lips almost blue, but it was her eyes that made his stomach drop. They were hollow, empty, as if there was nothing behind them. A deep, gnawing fear twisted in his gut. Then she smiled, not a normal smile. It was too wide, too unnatural. Mark's foot slammed on the gas before he even realized what he was doing. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the icy road before gaining traction. His pulse pounded in his ears as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't look back. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, the storm growing worse. Mark tried to shake the image of the woman from his mind, but the fear lingered. Then a movement in his peripheral vision. His heart nearly stopped. She was standing on the side of the road again. Exactly the same. Barefoot, white dress. That eerie, too wide smile. That was impossible. Mark's chest tightened. He pressed the gas harder. His truck roared forward, but the road seemed longer than he remembered, stretching endlessly into the darkness. He kept his eyes locked ahead, refusing to look at her. He just needed to make it into town. Just a few more miles. Then the whisper came, "Let me in." Mark's stomach turned to ice. The voice wasn't outside, it was inside the truck, right behind him. Cold breath brushed against his neck. Mark screamed and swerved, the truck skidding violently. The world tilted as the vehicle spun out of control, slamming sideways into a snowbank. Silence. His chest heaved as he gasped for air. Slowly, his shaking hands reached for the rearview mirror. Nothing. The back seat was empty. For a long moment, he sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to convince himself that he had imagined it. The stress, the lack of sleep, maybe even guilt, was playing tricks on him. Then came the knock. Soft, rhythmic, right outside his driver's side window. He didn't turn his head, didn't breathe. The knocking came again. Then the whisper. "Let me in." Something in Mark finally broke. He tore the door open and stumbled out, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The wind howled around him, but the road was empty. No footprints, no woman, just his truck, half buried in the snow. Mark didn't waste any more time. He ran. He didn't stop until he saw the faint glow of the town's lights in the distance. He never spoke about that night, never told anyone what had happened. But he never took that road again, and every winter when the first snow fell, he made sure he wasn't driving after dark, because deep down he knew she was still there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the trees like a mournful wail, carrying with it a bitterness that cut through the thickest coats. Snow had fallen in a steady, relentless curtain all day, blanketing the small mountain town in an eerie white stillness. By nightfall, the streets were empty, save for the occasional shadow of a lone traveler making their way home. Graham had always hated winter, but this night it felt different, heavier. His car had broken down a mile away from his cabin, forcing him to walk through the forest path, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The moon, obscured by thick clouds, cast long, dancing shadows from the skeletal trees. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. It wasn't paranoia, it was something deep in his bones, an instinctive fear that tightened his chest. The whispering wind carried with it faint sounds. Footsteps in the snow, though he never heard them start or stop. He turned sharply, scanning the path behind him. Nothing, just the endless stretch of trees, their frost-covered limbs twisting in the dim light. Shaking his head, he continued, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up his neck. He knew these woods well. He had hiked them since childhood, had walked this path hundreds of times, but tonight they felt foreign, altered. A sharp crack echoed in the silence. Graham froze, his breath visible in frantic puffs. The sound had come from the trees to his left. Slowly, he turned his head, his pulse hammering against his ribs. At first, he saw nothing but the dense wall of forest. But then, movement. A figure, barely visible against the snow, just beyond the tree line. His breath caught. It was standing still, almost blending into the landscape, but the darkness of its form was unmistakable. "Hello?" he called, though he immediately regretted it. His voice felt wrong in the thick quiet. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Graham took a step back, and the figure stepped forward. Cold fear seeped into his bones. The shape was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long for a person. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure took another step, and this time it was closer than it should have been, like the distance between them had shrunk impossibly fast. Graham turned and ran. His boots slid on the icy ground as he sprinted, his breath ragged in his chest. The sound of crunching snow followed, faster, closing the distance. He didn't dare look back. The cabin's porch light came into view, a beacon in the swallowing darkness. His fingers fumbled with the keys as he reached the door, his heart slamming against his ribs. He threw himself inside and slammed the door, locking it with shaking hands. Silence. His breath came in uneven gasps. The room was warm, but the chill remained in his bones. Slowly, he moved to the window, peering out through the frost-covered glass. At first, there was nothing but the trees, the snow-covered path. Then, movement. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Still, watching. Graham stumbled back from the window, his mind racing. A sharp knock rattled the door. His stomach dropped. It was light, almost polite. Another knock. Then a whisper. Not words, but a sound like breath against the wood. His hands clenched into fists. He wouldn't answer. He wouldn't acknowledge it. The whispering continued, a slow, insidious sound that seeped into the room. Then, silence. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Finally, he gathered the courage to look through the peephole. Nothing. The forest was still. The path was empty. Relief washed over him in a wave so strong his knees nearly buckled. Maybe it had been his imagination, the cold, the exhaustion. Then from behind him, a whisper. Close. Too close. The end.
Story number 4.
The cold was unrelenting. It crept through the trees, coiled around the old wooden house, and seeped through the walls like an unwelcome presence. The storm had hit harder than expected, blanketing the forest in thick snow and trapping Daniel inside the remote cabin he had rented for the weekend. He had come for solitude, to clear his head, but now he found himself staring at the flames in the fireplace, listening to the wind howl outside like a wounded animal. The isolation wasn't what bothered him. It was the silence between the gusts of wind, the heavy, unnatural stillness that settled over the cabin as if the world outside no longer existed. At first, he had blamed his nerves on the unfamiliarity of the place. It was old, creaky, the kind of house that seemed to shift in the night, settling into itself. But as the hours dragged on, a sense of unease crept up his spine. Something was off. The first sign had been the footprints. They weren't his. When he had gone outside earlier that afternoon to gather some firewood, he had seen them. Deep impressions in the snow leading from the forest to the cabin. They stopped at the porch steps. No trail leading away. Just vanished. Daniel had told himself it was nothing. Maybe the snow had covered the exit trail, or maybe he had just not been paying attention. He forced himself to forget about it. But then came the knocking. It was soft at first, a single, slow knock against the wooden door. Daniel had stiffened, the hair on the back of his neck rising. No one should have been out there. The nearest town was miles away, and the storm had made the roads impassable. He approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called out. Silence. He waited, his breath visible in the cold air. He pulled the curtain aside and peered outside. Nothing but snow and darkness. Maybe it had been the wind. He locked the door. The hours passed, and the storm raged on. The cabin creaked and groaned under the weight of the wind, and Daniel tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He busied himself by reading a book, drowning out the howling outside. Then the knocking returned. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Daniel shot up from the couch, heart pounding. That was not the wind. He grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and inched toward the door. His hands were clammy despite the chill in the air. He swallowed hard and placed his ear against the wood. Silence. He gripped the handle and yanked the door open. Nothing. The wind howled in his face, whipping snow into the doorway. The porch was empty. The footprints, if they had ever been there, were now gone, swallowed by the storm. He shut the door, locking it again. The storm eventually began to ease, and with it came an unsettling quiet. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room. Daniel sat in the armchair, staring at the door, waiting. Then he heard it. Not from the door this time, from inside the cabin. A whisper, low, almost unintelligible. His body went rigid. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There was no one there. The fire flickered. Then came another whisper, closer this time. Daniel's blood turned to ice. It was coming from the bedroom. He stood slowly, gripping the fire poker tighter. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he moved toward the partially open bedroom door. The whispering had stopped, but a deep, bone-chilling cold radiated from the room. He nudged the door open with the poker. The room was empty, but the window was open. Snow had piled onto the floor beneath it, the wind pushing in cold air. He knew for a fact that he had shut that window when he arrived. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped closer. Then he saw them. Footprints. Wet footprints on the wooden floor leading from the window to the side of the bed. And then they stopped. No exit trail, no continuation, as if whoever or whatever had entered had simply vanished. A rush of terror surged through him. He slammed the window shut and backed out of the room, refusing to turn his back on the darkness. He made his way to the fireplace, stoking the flames higher, as if the light could protect him. He didn't sleep. The night stretched on, the wind whispering through the trees like 1,000 hushed voices. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, and every creak of the old cabin sent shivers down his spine. Then, just before dawn, he heard it one last time. A whisper, right behind him. "Let me in." Daniel turned sharply, his breath hitching. Nothing, just the empty cabin, the dying fire, and the lingering sense that he was not alone. The storm had passed by morning. He wasted no time packing his things, throwing everything into his bag with shaking hands. As he stepped outside, he froze. The footprints were back, leading from the cabin into the woods. He never looked back. Story the end.